This video comes to you in the wake of me having just made some adjustments to the future video schedule, whereby 2 weeks from now, rather than what we would have been talking about otherwise, we're instead going to have a discussion about my possible aphantasia. But as for the future, for now, hello and welcome to the Ragnarök Chronicles. My name is Dominic and this is the channel where we talk about the lore of the books that I am writing, or in today's case, might write someday. It's slightly more in question. Me being me, as has probably been established before, I can get a bit overambitious where creativity is concerned. Just come up with these things that I would like to do, but then there come the matter of practicality and time and all this other stuff as to whether I can actually execute upon all of those ideas. As well as the Ragnarök Chronicles itself as an overall franchise, which I've acknowledged many times will take decades to create. I also have other aspirations to work in television, for instance, and that is definitely still the other main goal career-wise, although regardless of whether we do succeed in doing that, there will be other, usages of time in terms of whatever career sector I end up in to actually have a form of reliable income. My point is, though, beyond the scope of what the Ragnarök Chronicles is hopefully going to be, and beyond in turn what other creative pursuits I might want to do within television, there is also a middle ground where there's other things that I want to create which are separate from the Ragnarök Chronicles, however they're nevertheless also connected to it, these being spin-offs. Over the years, I have come up with 5 concepts for spin-offs to this franchise. I thought, yeah, I'll do those as well. Probably at the end of all of it. Again, going to be many decades away, and we don't know what my situation is going to be at that stage. But as stated, with other commitments to time being everything else going on in life, it's, I shouldn't be counting my chickens before they count the eggs before they hatch. Whatever the appropriate saying is, that may not even be right for this situation, but I shouldn't be worrying about creating these spin-offs before I'm not even done with the main Ragnarök Chronicles that they would be spinning off from. Of these 5, there is one in particular that I am thinking, or I am most inclined towards, yes, I do want to do that one. Perhaps because that is the one that I came up with most recently, therefore it has some kind of favour by temporal proximity, but either way, these other things would be side projects, or, as I say, the main idea for the earlier ones would be that they would be written after the fact to continue on within a connected reality of sorts after this first major lifelong project is otherwise done. The purpose of today's video, therefore, is I just want to take you through the broad stroke concepts of what these spin-offs potentially could be or would have been, because I don't know if they're actually going to come to fruition to the same way that I am definitely going to do whatever I can to get the main franchise all completed and done. And with me having said these things, we can see, well, what would you think to them potentially as things to consume, probably written-wise. But to go through chronologically, the earliest then set-wise of these spin-offs would have been a one-off book called The Species of Origin. Now, Origin as a thing within the reality of the Ragnarök Chronicles isn't something I've actually talked about before. The people who are Origin themselves, I'm not really going to give too much detail to at this stage, but from the title, as well as just being a spinning around of the origin of species, on the origin of species, species of origin, this would be seeing, with them being main characters in it, the end of the previous iteration of the multiverse. I've mentioned previously that within the parameters, the perspective of the Ragnarök Chronicles, the multiverse has gone through different iterations, and talk about how the first conflict within our iteration of the multiverse, when talking about the beta incursion, for instance, I'd say this would talk about the very end of the previous iteration, seeing how that ended, leading into what for us would have been the Big Bang, see the origins there, also see the plight of the angels / Angelos, as again I've talked about in a previous very early video on this channel, how they were a species which managed to varying degrees, make it through the cataclysm of the changing of reality. There isn't much of a concept to the plot of this book. As it stands, it's more just the idea that it's a prequel. It would give more of a backstory to the Angelos, a bit more of a backstory to Origin, or just something would be come up with it ultimately regardless ending in the Big Bang. Next, the second chronologically actually doesn't have a overarching title per se, and it is the most varied. Rather like how the Ragnarök Chronicles is, comprised of, or will be comprised of, smaller sub-series which are distinct from one another but ultimately connected. This is kind of like that, but to another level, wherein you would have these different series or one-off books which technically are connected in a way that I'll clarify in a second. However, these would be completely distinct and separate stories and types, even across different realities, potentially. Another thing that I've mentioned in previous videos is the idea of the Exodus aliens, so called because I haven't come up with a name for them yet, because the stories that involve them are very far down the line, so they won't actually be called that in the final products, but they refer to them as such because they, in the beta realm, are looking to, during the time of the beta incursion, escape from our reality to find some other new multiverse out there in the wider panverse. These spin-offs, therefore, would be seeing where the Exodus aliens ended up across, again, multiple other multiverses, potentially, or within one we'll have to see, well, we would potentially see. It's always going to have an element of uncertainty to it when we're talking about these. But the idea that they found some other reality across the void, and they settled down there and they did what they did, and they introduced the genetics of all of the species from our multiverse into this new place so they could evolve and kind of restart afresh without any of the burdens and parameters of our reality. So then generations down the line, we would have across these different worlds, these completely different stories who were the descendants from who were on the Exodus aliens ship. That therefore being the connective thread. Really, these stories that were put into this category, this other smaller franchise, were just stories that it did not make sense to try to force into the Ragnarök Chronicles themselves, these being a lot more fantastical. For instance, a one-off story which goes by the name of Covenant. I'm pretty sure that... maybe I looked into the definition of what it was, but off the top of my head I probably didn't. I just would have got the word from like the Ark of the Covenant, and there'd be some vague association in my younger mind that fits therefore, but I don't know. Either way, you have this story about, your typical monsters of vampires, zombies, ghosts, werewolves, swamp things. Anyway, these different creatures around a world otherwise of humans, and in this case you have some central antagonist vampire with his zombie chauffeur, and they're going around with this weapon which takes on a different form depending on the species who's holding it. So it will be a different kind of weapon when a vampire holds it, when a zombie holds it, when a human holds it, and so under the premise of some sort of mending of ancient broken ties, the vampire is going around and powering up this weapon by having it in different contrived circumstances being offered to members of the different species, and this in turn somehow feeding back into making the weapon more powerful. You also have the purposeful creation of like these hybrid monsters and so forth. And meanwhile, your protagonists are more this family of humans, so the grandfather who has been studying this sort of thing for years and trying to uncover it, and then the members of the younger generations now coming along besides and eventually trying to stop this, and ultimately, defeating the monsters, but in a unfortunate twist at the end, you have that the ghosts who, throughout this, in terms of the paradigms of monsters, they're not related into any of the actual conflicts that's going on. Rather, they're more, pensive bystanders who more witness all that's going on and have some more moral high ground judgment, whatever, is separate to all of this. Meanwhile, with all of the main monsters and threats gone, and humanity meanwhile in a state of recovery, the ghosts then as a collective revealing actually how many there are of them, and more the notion is that in the power vacuum left by the defeat of all the other monsters, the ghosts would now take over, so nevertheless leading to humanity's fall for all the victory that the protagonists had. So that one very different kind of story than what's in the Ragnarök Chronicles and so forth. There's another that would have been more of a series that is more superhero kind of based, and I've seen notions kind of along this line in like Tumblr posts and so forth since then, so I'm by no means saying that this aspect is entirely original to my own mind, but the stimulus originally was the idea of, you have these superheroes with their alter egos rather, but none of this group of friends realise that any of the other ones are the other superheroes that they are otherwise their alter egos of interaction. So a group of superheroes, a group of regular acquaintances, none realising the connections between any of them, so they're always trying to keep it secret from one another. More than that though, more than that kind of, I guess, potentially sitcom-y kind of element to it, the other differential here being that rather than just having superpowers, rather, you instead have that persona, the alter ego, is actually its own possessive entity, essentially. You are taken over by this thing that possesses you, which happens to have powers and then does the saving of the day unless it's a villain in turn, but I'm pretty sure there was going to be an element furthermore of nuances of is actually any of them a villain, and it's all different angles. But anyway, so there's this dilemma of each of them can want to allow themselves for periods to be taken over by this other presence to create these superheroes and allow them to go around and save the day, to do good, but the more that they do this, the more they lose of themselves, until eventually, in theory, all that would be left would be this other foreign persona that now just happens to be inhabiting their body. And then just a third example in the simplest of terms, because the least detail, there was another case where I wanted to do my own version of the Del Toro books, or something in that sort of vein. Del Toro being a series of kids' books I really enjoyed growing up, and now having recalled them again for preparing for this video, I do want to read them again. Really interesting, really creative fantasy stories. But anyway, this idea of I would come up with some fantasy realm with different areas, and you'd have different stories going to different places to deal with different magical obstacles and threats and locales, etc. That sort of thing, and just being creative in that sense. Meanwhile, you have some overarching, ever-present evil presence where there's then also some twist of what the characters think they're doing to try to banish that evil is actually part of a misdirect that it has set up, and rather by doing this thing they've actually now granted it even more power and so forth to then have to be dealt with on an even more dire circumstance in the latter part. As I suggested, I don't really have that much detail to that. It probably is somewhere, however, also referring back to Covenant and other elements, it's one of those things where either I've lost notes that I've made on those stories, or I just never wrote them down in the first place. I'm aware of Covenant specifically, that I have notes breaking down the first half of the story, maybe the first third, and I happen to remember off the top of my head that the ending involved the ghosts and so forth. But there's just a whole second half of the plot that I know I came up with something really intricate and detailed actually about how the different politics between the different monsters was being conducted and who was tricking who, and how that led to how the humans were trying to do it, but how that didn't work, so they had to turn to the ghosts to try to find some sort of potion and whatever. But I have no notes on any of that I can find. It's really annoying. Same here, I'm pretty sure I have details for that. So that's just an overview to put a pin in that, so this video doesn't just all become about that side of things. of what that spin-off would have become. This is by far the loosest connected thing of the spin-offs. The rest have something more specific here, but this would, as I say, literally just be the distant descendants on far different worlds and a different reality of characters that we meet on some occasion far down the line. Really, I could just do those stories individually themselves, but me being me, I had to try to make everything interconnected. The next separate spin-off from that would come chronologically is actually the one that I came up with most recently, which, as I acknowledged previously, is the one that I have the currently greatest notion of. I'll probably try to get that one done, therefore I'm going to save describing that one until the end of this video, rather than next, therefore we'll jump to the subsequent one after that, which is the Survivor's World. So this is set in the actual aftermath to the whole arc of the Ragnarök Chronicles itself, after that climax conclusion, and with this there isn't actually an overarching plot line in place. There's a start of one, but there's no goal in sight. Again, for these books, acknowledged even when these were being come up with, that this would be being done after all of the other Ragnarök Chronicles stuff, because this one has to, especially, unlike the previous ones, potentially they could have been done whatever, but this one, because it is explicitly set in the aftermath of the final book of the Ragnarök Chronicles, if I was to write this spin-off before that conclusion, there's going to be spoilers in there. It's not going to do this, it's definitely going to be there, and because I don't know how old I'm going to be at that point, there's no point now trying to already nail down, I also want to make sure I achieve all of this. It's more, I have a first couple of stories, and then if I was to do this, we would just see where the narrative took us, just how would it go along, which is probably how more series writers go about things, I imagine. But it begins, rather than with a novel, with a novella, purely because I don't think that the plot could fill out a full novel, not because I insist that I really want to try doing a novella. But We Are Uniform sees a future Earth where, with everything that's been done to the actual surface to make it largely uninhabitable, rather the humans or the... I don't know if it would necessarily be full speciation, but some latter development of humans have instead built societies above the ground. So upon these different platforms, on massive pillars encompassing the entire planet. So still, the actual natural surface isn't having the best of chances at repairing because a lot of sunlight is blocked out. But on this higher mechanical canopy built around it, you have those humans where they're living. And recognising, however, that throughout history there has been just constant conflict between these and other, intentional otherwise destruction of environments, etc. And they want to find a solution to this. If they are going to continue as a species, they need to work out how things can actually be done beneficially, cooperatively, and so forth. The solution that was come up with was that humanity would, for a temporary period, become uniform. This means that every single human would lose every element that made them distinct. So any particular bodily features, different hairstyles, colours, skin colours, facial hair, heights, proportions, everything would be, through some bioengineering mechanism, stripped away to leave you with just a perfectly neutral template of Homo sapiens, well, whatever it is that they have next become in their polluted future. From here, they would also think the same, and as a uniform collective, they are set to finding that solution. Because while they're uniform, they recognise this is not the ideal by any means. However, by making everyone exactly the same, by removing any temptations or obstacles that might either lead to other distractions or conflicts or discord, they in that state should be in the position to have their best chance at working together to find some solution to the curse of humanity in terms of aggression, conflict, everything that I've been indicating. The structures that they are living upon is a form of the internet. So while it's not like a supercomputer per se that's controlling all of the uniforms, it's nevertheless monitoring them, and it's in turn the system upon which they would do any research, and also it would be paying attention to if a solution was ever found to this. It would then reset everyone back to the bodies that they should have, or the identities that they should have. Everyone will go back to what they should be. The only exceptions being that if during all of this there's any sign that any individual, for whatever glitch, happened to manifest again some kind of individuality, they would be terminated to maintain the uniform during this process. That's why I say it'll probably be difficult to maintain this premise for an entire book when literally the entire population is identical and any individuality should be terminated. That being said, the premise of the story itself rather sees then one or more, by some accident, ending up going down to the natural surface itself and having some other encounters with things that I won't give the details of because they tie back to some things in the Ragnarök Chronicles itself on the surface, and that informs your actual events of the story, rather than just seeing them trying to work towards finding the solution to humanity's problems. And at the end of it, while I'm not sure I actually came up with something, it would need to be more something to do with bringing down or getting rid of the higher internet societies upon which humanity is living, because the alternative is I end the story with them actually finding the absolute perfect solution to how do you implement world peace, and that's not something that I think I'm going to try to claim that I've come up with. Either way, in the wake of We Are Uniform, we get into the actual main stories. Maybe for consistencies, these would be novellas as well, so Survivor's World would be just a set of novellas rather, but whatever they ended up being, we now see the uniforms with more their personalities being brought back, presented with this new world which might be starting to heal, only to find that the whole premise for them agreeing to temporarily become uniform was built upon a deception. The person whose very idea it originally was to do this to humanity, as part of convincing people to go along with it, was they would partake in it as well, because they agree with this mission. No. That person, along with other individuals, usually wealthy or with some other ties to the person who came up with it, rather had been in stasis in these pods out elsewhere in the solar system, and when internet detected everything that happened in We Are Uniform, it prompted them to come back. So those people have now returned to Earth from their point of view, never having undergone any sort of change. So for all that again, this is now in a scenario where we probably didn't actually come to a solution to world conflict, however I'm phrasing that. Anyway, we now have more source for discord in this sense of betrayal. That's not all though, we're not just focusing on the humans / whatever became of humans next. You also would have then this introduction of another alien race who come to Earth, which, again, this is another instance where I think either I have lost notes on this, or I never wrote them in the first place, and rather sometime later I came up with alternatives, because I don't remember exactly as much of what the plan for this was, other than this other alien race were shunned by a third lot of aliens out in space because they had, the first lot had inadvertently caused some sort of great damage and destruction to other worlds that had tried to be hospitable to them, so they're now being hunted down out of revenge. You have specifically these three hunters, as it were, kind of. And you've got one who is more like the judicial person, one who's specifically an executioner, and then a third who is kind of unique in that, and he's more just searching for them. He's leading the search for these aliens in turn, and he has a unique mechanism of travelling around the universe, which I did at some point have some sci-fi technobabble explanation for how it works. I don't think I do anymore, but either way, it's just the idea of he has this sphere that he holds in his hand, and by then otherwise having a spacesuit or whatever to disconnect him from the rest of reality around him, because otherwise feeling the effects of physics and whatever moving around, just by looking into this sphere, he can suddenly travel vast distances between stars and so forth. Oh, that was it. Yes, it was... Oh, okay. Again, I'm not remember it entirely, but it's something to do with using the relative positions of the stars to slingshot yourself around and connecting with them over vast distances. I'm not going to be explaining this very well, because I'm half remembering this, and it's all nonsense technobabble anyway. The point is, you then have, as I say, this Earth, which in the process of being healed is now finding itself being populated again by disparate factions, so a couple of which are humans, and you've also got new alien arrivals with their own problems coming in their wake, and it's ultimately about these different groups trying to find ways to cohabit this planet. Meanwhile, there is one character who comes from the Ragnarök Chronicles themselves, who carries over, again, as well as being that extra linchpin to confirm the connection, acts as a sort of person who can recognise this is the state of things on a wider cosmic scale. This is what the grander stakes are, as it were. And so that would continue developing in whichever directions I end up coming up with at whatever age for however long I wanted it to. If that, though, is what happens within the aftermath still of our iteration of the multiverse, because, as already said in this video itself, we have different iterations of multiverses, they keep going through cycles, we also have, with the prequel, Species of Origin, what about the sequel of the multiverse version of this reality that comes after ours? This is where we get to the Utopian saga, which really is just a trilogy according to the plan, but like Species of Origin, while there's an underlying base premise, there's not actually that much detail to what the plot itself would be. In this case, in this new reality that we have, the structure of actually reality that we currently exist in, as I've talked about in a number of videos before, that is the reality that the Ragnarök Chronicles is taking place within, with your alpha realm, beta realm, outer region, inner region, all this different stuff. That is not how a multiverse usually would be. That is very strange. Usually, existence would be as we in the real world actually acknowledge it as probably being like, in terms of just a continuous expanding whatever, space. A single plane, as it were. With that, because we're not having to partition reality off into different bubbles and sections, this subsequent reality, it's not a multiverse really, it's just a single universe, but it's now able to take up all of that volume that our reality does, and so everything is on a bigger scale. Literally, it's just like one, maybe not a solar system, but so between a solar system and a galaxy, a cluster of planets and so forth, taking up, on a larger scale, the volume that our entire multiverse currently takes up. So it's all bigger scale, the atoms are bigger scale, everything, perspective-wise. So you wouldn't even really recognise this if you were living there, if you were born there. It's more if we were to take a step back and look at this, say, from a panversal perspective, look at it, we would notice this very tiny to massive. Either way, the setup here is that every individual of the single dominant species that is there has their own world that they're able to customise to whatever they want it to be. So everyone essentially has their utopia, hence the Utopian saga. Thus, in theory, everyone should have exactly what they would want, because they can change their planet to be whatever it is that they would like it to be. The plot threads across the trilogy, therefore, would be seen that despite this, despite Utopia, after enough time, nevertheless, you would still end up with some circumstances leading to discord between them, and we'll then see the ripple effects and consequences of those conflicts. And then again, there would just be some details here or there to acknowledge that it's specifically coming in the wake of our multiverse as presented in the Ragnarök Chronicles. But with that, let's go back to the middle, chronologically wise, of the spin-offs, which I am not going to tell you the prospective name of. Again, because I'd say at this stage, this is the one that I have the highest inclination towards writing. I'll say that it's like it would be framed as a set of children's books, a series of children's books. Well, this is where, again, I think of things more as TV shows, potentially, rather than book series, as they should be, because that's how I more initially consumed media when I was younger. But either way, if I think of these as seasons, these like sets of children's books, and so Series 1, Series 2, Series 3, with different progressions within that and different overarching themes and so forth, and connected narratives. I would be writing these under a pseudonym, so again, that's also part of why I'm not going to tell you what the actual title is now, and rather, we'd have to get into the semantics of the science of it, and again, I don't really want to discuss that for potential clarify, but it is connected, or would be connected to the Ragnarök Chronicles, tangentially, sideways to it, kind of. It's yes and no to is it the same reality. It's complicated like that. But I would be interested to see if I'm presenting these more as just their own separate thing under a different name. Just here's some children's fictions. I'm curious if anyone would pick up on the connections and see how an event in, say, some of these children's books may actually line up with something that happens in one of the Ragnarök Chronicles books. So this would be where, unlike some of the other ones, like Survivor's World and Utopian Saga, I would be writing these books concurrent with the Ragnarök Chronicles, probably just in my spare time, besides my actual work as well, maybe when I'm suffering from writer's block or something like that for the main books. I was okay, I'll now instead have a go at adding some more to that younger audience targeted stuff. Phrasing. With that audience, each story, short stories, each of them would intend to have some sort of educational message behind it. So either just say, now you know something about this thing from history, or here's a thing in science, or maybe moral messages in a couple of times as well. But either way, these different concepts that I think are interesting, but more than presented in a way that can be understood for children within the package of a fun little adventure. That then, more for my sake, in terms of why do I actually, that'll be interesting to write about, being set within a different method of looking at a version of the world that, again, it would be interesting to explore. It would be unlike any other kind of world that's existing in any of the other stories that I'm telling. The one other detail I may give, just as kind of let's tease, is, still not being too specific, there may be dinosaurs. With that, although rather than just giving further vague teasers that I'll be going back and forth, or should I say this, should I not? So, leave that there. Those are, in broad strokes, the 5 different kinds of spin-offs that I have at times or another thought of for doing for the Ragnarök Chronicles down the line, definitely not anytime soon. But what would you think? Again, obviously, a lot of those don't have specific plots towards them. There are more just premises, but do you think any of them have potential? Any of them that you might be interested in? Again, with the one about the Exodus aliens, that is just other stories that could be anything. But still, what would you think potentially to that? To having these different, completely disparate stories, but under an umbrella thing connecting them by a vague alien backstory. But so collecting them all together nevertheless, more than just being by the same author. If you have any thoughts about those sorts of things, you can obviously say them in the comment section down below, or their social medias that you can message me by, links, description. If rather you think I should just stick to the Ragnarök Chronicles itself, at least for now, then there's plenty of other videos on the channel talking about that, just specifically in itself, that you can check out, as there will be going forward as well. So in general, on that notion, be sure to keep an eye on the channel to not miss any of that. With that anyway, I hope you found this interesting, and until I see you again, the main thing is to just keep on telling stories, although maybe don't over-plan yourself for all the stuff that you want to do, like I, as I say, have done, as was the impetus for all of this today.